Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 100th video in our Master Series. Yeah, dude. And it is the 14th video in our subgroup mixing and the 5th video in our backing tracks. Tonight we want to talk about another very unique application of subgroups. This is washes. Now, washes can have two different effects. These are really cool things to fill out the spectral field and to fill out the stereo field to make a production sound thicker, richer, and lusher. So the concept here is there's a couple different things. The first thing is this can be behind everything. So you, in a simple production, you've got the vocals, harmonies, guitar maybe, and the piano on, and you've got maybe bass and drums. And these would be sitting way back behind that, doing chordal changes, things like G, A, D, and just following the chordal projection of the song, sometimes in just different sections to make it sound thicker, richer, and lusher in certain sections. And or you can bring it up right underneath like the backing tracks that we talked about in the last video when we talked about like beneath, right beneath your out front tracks and your supportive tracks, the type of backing tracks we talked about in the last video, like the guitar, piano, or something like that. These can be sitting right underneath those. The biggest thing to remember is that if you have them kind of up above your bass and your drums, that they're really riding up, up underneath the backing tracks like we talked about in the last video, that a couple different things. The listener is going to be able to hear the texture of them a lot better and be able to define the texture of them. So sometimes, an example, sometimes it's not really good to have an orchestra right behind something you're doing in production because it ain't going to sound right. But it would be okay to do it with some pad synths. So really keep that in mind. The next thing is that it covering up your bass and your drums in your rhythm section. If your bass isn't really performing a lot of musical duties, it is musical, but it's not so much of an interplay what's happening, and it's not so prominent, and it's more of a rhythm section, that you want to make sure that the transients of the drums and the bass don't get drowned out by this, because basically with these washes, the cool thing is you can add a lot of reverb, like we talked about our spatialization preset. You can add a lot of it to these to really muddy them up so they blend together really well. So it's like a really muddy blended wash that has this really cool, harmonic texture that's, creating a sound unto itself from blending, so that doesn't muddy your the stuff underneath it. Back behind it, it won't matter so much, because if you got it behind everything else will be sound much more clear. And you may want to back off your your presets on your your spatialization presets on the things above it to make them a little bit more clear, because of the muddy wash that's back behind it, that's just following the chordal progression sometimes of the production. And you can do different things, do it in different sections differently, and all kinds of things, or in just certain sections, and you can add a lot to where it's filling out the spectral field nice and full. It's filling out the stereo field because you've panned different ones of them. You've either, like if you had like synths or pad synths or something, you could duplicate those tracks and pan them off, to all kinds of different areas to really fill out the stereo field also, to make it sound thick, rich, and full in the stereo field and the spectral field. That's a really cool thing to do. One big precaution you have to be careful of is something like if you've got like, we're dealing with like, an orchestra, like you're going to make a subgroup of an orchestra that's going to be a wash like that, having the bass over on the left-hand side, like the contrabass, and a shrilly violin on the right side will deter from that effect. So you have to be real careful of that so that doesn't happen. So that basically, something in a situation like that, let's say that I had strings, brass, and woodwinds, that I would be, bouncing back and forth the low end. The low end of the strings would be over here, the low end of the brass would be over on the other side, and maybe the low end of the woodwinds would be centered or something like that. That way that I'm not hearing bass on one side and high end on the other side, because it really takes away from the effect of the wash. So really keep that, trying to balance, the spectral field that way, that so that it can have the effect that you're looking for. You can do all kinds of the things that we talked about so far in the subgroup mixing to these washes, and a lot of times you can do a lot more to them, because they're really not trying to, if they're way in the back and behind everything, that the listener's not going to really hear them prominent, and he's not really going to distinguish their sounds really well, except for perceiving that it's really filled out the stereo field and the spectral field to make it sound thicker and lusher, but it's really non-definitive, and it's really hard for them to define the sound. And that's kind of the effect you want. If you bring it up, take the things into consideration I talked about, but remember that you may have to be a little bit more selective in what type of instruments you use, because some things might not sound good behind some certain productions, because the listener can really hear that that's a string section behind what's going on, and that just doesn't work for this type of production. Does that make sense? And you might switch to pad synths or something like that. That's more sounds comparable and complementary to whatever your production is you're working. But this is a really cool subgroup, and a really cool subgroup mixing concept that can really have a profound effect on your production. It can take a really cheesy sounding production that sounds thin and like it just doesn't have enough in it, and it just sounds like it's just thin, and it just sounds empty, and it can make that production or certain sections of that production sound really full, so that it adds all this body to it, richness and lushness, to what's going on, to fill out those areas, so that the people will still be focused on those other things we talked about: the out front vocals, the supportive tracks, the backing tracks like the guitar or piano or something, the drum and the bass, but it's going to make them sound fuller. Because in a lot of cases, it won't be real definitive what that is that they're hearing is the sound, because it's so far back, but it's going to add that thick, rich, lush fullness to the production that's going to take away that thin, empty kind of sound that you're just sitting back going, it just sounds thin and empty, and it just could use something, it just needs more or something, and I've run into that. Sometimes I've had that happen, and it can be very true. So really keep that in mind, that this can do that, and it can do a really good job. Just be real careful of the things I talked about. Be real careful about taming the dynamics. You really want to tame the dynamics of these, because you don't want them jumping into anybody's area anyway, no how, way, shape, or form, so that they can perform their role well. And sometimes, like I said, that you can add a lot of reverberation and spatialization effect to them to really blend them, to where you come out with this really cool subgroup that's this really cool blended sound that's just rich, thick, full, and lush, and it's got a lot of reverb in it, but you got all this other stuff that's got a lot of clarity sitting on top of it to have that contrast that can just add this really cool effect to your production. So not only is this a creative aspect, but this is also a mixing aspect, because basically this can affect your creative, what you do in the creative area, and also when you get to mixing, to understand you can do this with things to really fill out your mix, to make it sound, so it doesn't sound thin and empty, like it's just missing something. I've had productions like that, and it's just like, well, the band sounds pretty good, but it just sounds, empty, and it's like, and I can't get the bass player and the guitar player to do something else so that their stuff sounds better. They like that sound, and so I've come up with some other ways, something like this, to really make it sound, sound fuller, and sometimes there's been add a keyboardist to their band, that's doing pad synths or something in the background that might change their sound a little bit, but a lot of times that may not exactly be what you're shooting for, besides just kind of filling out the spectral field and the stereo field, so that it doesn't sound so thin and weak. So this is a really cool technique to work on. Once again, it's really a matter of taste. So The concept is very simple, and the mixing concept is very simple because basically how you mix this is going to be a personal taste. The concept of what you're trying to do is what I'm trying to get across to you, as it's a very viable mixing subgroup mixing concept, and for you to practice with it and throw it on some of your mixes and bring it up in there for certain sections or part of the mix or a bridge or the lead or whatever's going on, to try to just give it more power. Does that make sense? So it can empower a lead, a chorus section, or a lead section or a bridge or something like that. It can just make it sound a lot more powerful and have much more impact on the listener and make the production have more impact. So I hope you experiment with that. And like I said, any of the things techniques we've talked about in the subgroup mixing so far, you can apply to this. And you don't really have to worry about it too much because it's really way in the back. So you really don't have to be quite so careful with it. Be careful about phase issues, because if you get phasey stuff going on, and it can still affect the mix. But other than that, you really won't have to worry about too many other things besides making sure you tame the dynamics of the performance. So I hope you enjoy making some washes and mixing some washes. If you have any questions, just ping me on the channel, and it's a pretty simple concept that can really do a lot for your mix. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.